Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics today. Really excited to have Reverend Dr. Brian Rajcok here. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah. So can you give the audience a little bit of background on who you are and also maybe your introduction into psychedelics?
Yeah. My name is Brian Rajcok. I am a Lutheran pastor at St. Matthew Lutheran Church in Avon, Connecticut. And let's see, I'll sort of maybe start with my where I've lived, educational background kind of thing. So I grew up in Connecticut, Bethlehem, Connecticut. And then I went to college in Indiana, where I was a theology major. So I've always been interested in theology, science and religion, spirituality, mysticism, that sort of thing. And when I went to college, I knew I wanted to be a theology major. And so then after college, went to seminary in Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and then did a semester in Berkeley, the seminary there, my second year, and then my internship was in Denver, Colorado, and then back to Minnesota for my final year of seminary. And after I graduated, my first congregation was in Pennsylvania. And then from there, I was also involved in the start of my Ph.D. program. So I was, for a year and a half, I commuted from the Allentown area, Cherryville was where my church was, to Loyola University down in Columbia, Maryland. And then when they announced that their pastoral counseling program was closing, I transferred to Newman University, which is outside of Philly, Aston, Pennsylvania. And that's where I finished my PhD program. And well, I actually entered straight into their PhD program because I was working on my master's in counseling at Loyola. So at Newman was where I did my PhD. And then
Oh, and what was your PhD in?
so that was in pastoral counseling. And for my dissertation was on the lived experience of professional mental health clinicians with spiritually significant psychedelic experiences. And just graduated in December, had my final defense
Congratulations.
last October. Thank you. Thank you. And so, yeah, now, and I will say too, in 2019 is when I moved back to Connecticut, and I've been serving St. Matthew Lutheran Church since then, first as associate pastor, and then after our senior pastor left, I was sort of interim for a year, and then just this past March was officially called as the new senior pastor. So that's,
Amazing. Congrats. That's
yeah,
exciting.
thank you. Thank you.
So I'm curious like where your interest in psychedelics started to come from. Like, did you have a pretty religious upbringing? Like, were you really embedded in the church and that's what kind of brought you to want to become a pastor? And yeah, what was your process like?
Yeah, so yeah, I was raised going to church every Sunday, and um, both my mom and dad are religious, spiritual people, and so my brother and I, we were raised in the. My mom was raised Catholic, my dad Lutheran, and then when they got married and brought us to church, we all went to the Lutheran church together, and so and I had a great pastor growing up who was very influential in my life, and really once I was interested in theology and spirituality and that sort of thing, um, had a lot of support around me to encourage that from a uh, faith background. And I think that my tradition was also always very open minded. So the Lutheran Church, my particular denomination is the ELCA. It's a more progressive denomination. So have ordained women for I think over 50 years now. We're LGBT accepting and affirming. So it's a good denomination. And yeah, I think I knew that I wanted to be a pastor or at least study theology, um, maybe be a professor or something like that since the time I was young. And then from some experiences that I had when I was younger, really started to see that psychedelics can be a real avenue to the divine, that psychedelics can facilitate deeply spiritually meaningful experiences. And then my senior year of college, I had the opportunity to write my senior thesis on the Native American Church peyote ceremony. And I was blessed to have the opportunity to attend a peyote ceremony. And that was, I'll say, the most spiritual experience of my life. After that experience, I became a vegetarian. I started daily meditation practice. I think I was always pretty open spiritually, but it really made me even more so interested in world religions, connected to God and nature. A much kind of a hippie tree hugging spirituality in some ways. And so that I think was, I look to that experience as a very profound moment in my life. And it, I think, helped solidify my call to go to seminary. I was debating at that point, I was a senior in college, and I was already kind of on track for that, but I think it just really solidified that sense of call for me. And then, yeah.
Are you do you feel comfortable going into a little bit about your peyote ceremony and like what the experience was like, and like when you say it was the most spiritually significant experience you've had, like what do you mean by that? Like what is a spiritually like
Mm,
significant experience to
yeah.
you?
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, there's so much to it. We So it was I was going to school in Valparaiso, Indiana, and this was a ceremony in Ohio in Serpent Mound State Park. They got permission to go there and have this ceremony there. It was really powerful. It was an all night ceremony. So in research I've done about peyote ceremony, this was sort of a little different from the traditional um, peyote ceremony, but we were out in the open rather than in a teepee setting. But we were under the stars, fire in the center, and there were um, probably the group of people were maybe half Native American and half of us were of other ethnicities, and it was uh, started at sunset, and then it was an all night ceremony. And I remember there was also this Episcopalian pastor there, and I had just met him that day. Uh, and the medicine man introduced us. He's like, "I really want you two to meet each other." And so he was a very, spiritually in tune guy, and so that was a part of the experience that was really helpful. I just felt comfortable with everybody, and during the ceremony, there was the belief that the peyote medicine helped expunge your impurities, or you a lot of people would vomit up, and so you were told to vomit into the fire, that it was kind of your
Mm,
um you know
offering of some sort.
yeah, yeah, you were purging. And then we all had our these things around our necks, like a necklace of some kind of herbs or grass or something. I honestly forget. Maybe it was sage. And then at the end of the ceremony, we put our burdens on that and offered it to the fire. And so it was a very profound experience for me. And just the sense of connection and being out under the stars. I mean, I remember, at first not really feeling much and then kind of surrendering to it and thinking, well, maybe I won't experience anything that profound and just kind of surrender to that and whatever happens, happens. And once I really did that and let go of those expectations is when really everything kicked in and started to be an amazing experience. And there were moments in the night where I felt like I was looking at the fire, having a feeling of being in hell. And then there was this shift of when I said, okay, if I'm in hell, accept that. And then I accepted that. And then there was this total emotional shift to like, wow, now I'm in heaven. And it was just this beautiful experience of like accepting the worst. And then once that work was done, it like shifted into this beautiful experience. So that was a very profound moment for me. There was another time that was just hilarious. I asked the medicine man what time it was. This is the middle of the night, and he looks at me. He's like, it's now. And I just started laughing. And then
It's a
we
good
started,
answer. It's a good
right,
answer.
right. It's now. And I was like, yeah, that's right. It is now. And so that was a really, really great experience. And then the next morning, there was this amazing sunrise ceremony that and there were people who really kind of struggled that night too, who were vomiting and had a lot of stuff they were dealing with, and we would lay hands on their shoulder as they kind of pray for them and that sort of thing. So there was probably about 20 people there, and so really felt like a family, even though had just met them all that day. It was a profound experience. And then the next morning, amazing sunrise ceremony, and tree hugging. That was kind of a, part of that too. And
The
then
side effects of psychedelics and medicines, you become a tree
right,
hugger.
right, exactly. So yeah, that was really great experience and helped me connect. I think I described it in my senior thesis as helped my connection to God, to other people, to nature, and to myself and the universe. I mean, everything. It really was an experience that helped me be connected to everything in a much deeper way. And after the experience, I felt so just liberated for people talk about afterglow, and this was so beyond any kind of afterglow I've heard described. I mean, I was like in a just incredible state for about, I don't know, a week or two afterwards. Just I felt like I was, the way I described it at the time was like walking with God,
Yeah,
and
that's beautiful.
yeah, yeah. So it
So,
was,
so I heard you say like it really deepened your connection with God and nature. Like growing up, like in the church, like did that change your relationship a little bit? Like a different perspective? Like how did it deepen that relationship?
yeah. Well, I think that I recognized the presence of the divine in all things in a way that, theologically we talk about the what is it, the omnipotence and the omnipresence of God, and it's these big theological words that you know don't have much meaning to uh, you know average folks. But I mean, those terms mean these deep things, like God is in all things. And um, I think really having an experience of that is was very important and profound for me. And the presence of consciousness in animals, and which is really played into becoming a vegetarian after that. And it deepened my prayer life in a lot of ways. I think that I got back from the peyote ceremony, and I was like singing hymns on my own, which I'd never done before, like and just
Yeah.
really. I had read the previous year read through the Bible in its entirety, but just kept doing that, and spiritual readings, getting into the mystics, the experience of the mystics, uh, has, I think, that kind of integration of that experience, even though I didn't know about psychedelic preparation and integration at the time, that was a very important part of my integration, was all of that, deepening my prayer life, reading more books on spirituality, getting into the mystics, uh, and that, I think, helped even more to make that a profound experience as I came out of it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and I guess I was just curious around that of like, yeah, being in the church and like, going, probably praying and having this relationship. But, have you ever had a deep experience like that, I guess, through normal practices from the church versus psychedelic, like assisted, right? Like, is
Yeah,
there a difference there for you?
yeah. I think probably through like my meditation practice, that's been I do centering prayer. And that's something that actually, after the peyote ceremony, as I was deepening my prayer life, I started a daily practice of centering prayer about a year later. It was kind of a progressive thing, but eventually um, made a New Year's resolution and just started doing that every day. And I've been doing that twice daily for about 12 years now. And so, in those kinds of personal contemplative prayer practices, I've had some pretty deep experiences. And I think of times growing up when I was at my first Vigil of Easter service, was probably, um, pre psychedelic anything. Um, Maybe what I would consider one of the most spiritual moments too. And the Vigil of Easter service, which I didn't realize at the time, I was like, I don't know, I must have been a junior in high school, maybe. Our pastor had asked me if I would do a reading at it, and I thought, oh, sure. Well, the Vigil of Easter service is like a 3 hour service, and it was, normal church service is about an hour, hour 15, but it was such a journey, and it's framed so wonderfully. It's the evening before Easter, so it's the most like spiritual service of the year. And it starts in like the darkness of the tomb and Christ's death, and ends in the resurrection and the light of Easter morning. And that was a very profound experience too. I remember going through that and just really having it as a journey, and that was really great, because so much of our faith tradition, I think, is based in other things besides experience, and I think that as people long for experience of the divine, it's services like that, it's meditation practices, it's different community events, that people really experience that spiritual connection. So that's, I would say, is one of the profound moments. And then when I was at Valpo, when I was in college, there was this beautiful chapel there, and having great, services there. And same thing with seminary and different, as you worship in different contexts and have experiences with different people. It's always a meaningful thing. I think people who go to church, it is very spiritually significant in a lot of ways, and it's that experiential, the experience of the divine that is uh, so important.
Yeah, right. Because how do you have a connection with something if the experience isn't there, right? I mean, I guess if it was just so kind of theoretical and, we're just talking about it, what does that mean? And I think that's like the really interesting part around psychedelics. It seems that it helps to maybe deepen one's experience or one's relationship. Maybe it helps to reveal that, oh, that actually is there. Because I can imagine without certain experiences, maybe people have a hard time connecting with it. It's almost like, you don't know what you don't know, right? And it's like until
Hmm.
you see or experience certain things, you go, oh, that exists now. Wow.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think of what they call the faith quadrilateral, that a person's faith is made up of uh, experience, scripture, tradition, and reason. So your own reflections on it and theology. And there were different periods of my life that I think I was more prone to one or the other of those. Certainly when you're a little kid, it's probably tradition, you're just going and it's part and you're absorbing that. And then maybe in my college years, I was very interested in the reason and the theological, systematic theology. And I've always been fascinated by the great mysteries of the universe and science and religion and, quantum mechanics and astrophysics and all that. And that's fascinating stuff to learn about and think about. And then I think what the peyote ceremony did for me was really shifted to a more experiential component, that there's something, very profound here, that is, incorporates all of those. I mean, and certainly, whether it's a scripture, any, religious text, whatever religion you are, plays a role in your process and formation, just like tradition, just like reason and theology. But really, the kind of culminating thing is the experience, and you learn that, wow, there's something real here, that is not just something we can think about. We can actually experience this sacredness of the universe.
Yeah, yeah. I would love to like switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about your dissertation. The really
Mm.
interesting title here, the lived experiences of professional mental health clinicians with spiritually significant psychedelic experiences. And so I'm wondering, how did you come up with this dissertation idea, and can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I knew really, especially since that peyote ceremony, that I wanted to do a PhD in psychedelic spirituality. And it's not a field that you could really study. So I knew that I would try to figure out how I would go about that. And talking to some different mentors, and really came to the sense that pastoral counseling would be probably the best avenue to go, because that would also then equip me if I wanted to pursue licensure and become a psychedelic assisted therapist as well. So it would kind of help with both of those things. And so when I was thinking about my dissertation, I had supportive professors who were curious about the idea, and they were open to it. So that was great. And yeah, what I did was I reached out to different people. That there was a whole, like, what do they call it? The recruitment process of where I ended up finding 17 professional mental health clinicians. So it was helped by, and I put this in I described this a little in my chapters 1 and 3 of my dissertation, the California Institute of Integral Studies Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Training Program sent out an email recruitment letter to alumni. And so people volunteered to have a Zoom interview with me. And then there were also people I knew personally who were interested in being participants in the study. But it had to be a mental health clinician, so a counselor, marriage family therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, or social worker. So that was um, one of the requirements. But then also having self reported spiritually significant psychedelic experiences themselves. And so during these interviews was a really amazing, people shared a lot of amazing experiences with me. And then at the end of that, I categorized them all and did the whole dissertation research, process of, well, the interviews actually came later on in the process. The chapters 1, 2, and 3 are written first, and then your proposal gets approved, and then you do the interviews. Then you write chapter 4. Then you write chapter 5. So it was a long process. I started it. I'd finished classwork and started it in spring of 2020, and that's when I did my chapter 2. Chapter 2, ironically, is the first thing you write rather than chapter 1. Um, and so I did that lit review, and that was a good experience in itself. I mean, I learned so much about all the psychedelic research. I mean, I had known before, obviously, a good amount too, but then really diving deep into all the research that was out there. And then chapters 1 and 3 are sort of what the study is. And then 4, after I got that approved, uh, is the longest chapter with all of the people's different experiences.
Interviews and
Uh,
stuff. Yeah.
so it was really, really interesting.
And I guess like what were you hoping to really explore with this? Like I guess like what was your hypothesis? And then did it match up? Like were you trying to explore like did these experiences impact the way that they provide care or got involved in this type of work? Or yeah, I guess yeah. What was your hypothesis here around this?
Right, right. Well, it was a qualitative study, which is more rather than like quantitative measures different outcomes. Qualitative is more about the recording people's experiences, um, and so there wasn't a like an actual hypothesis to measure certain outcomes, but there in the implications section talk a lot about what are the implications of this, what was I looking for. And I wanted to kind of gauge 3 things: religious spiritual commitment, religious spiritual tolerance, and religious spiritual multicultural counselor competency, so MCC. And one of the things that I noticed in myself about the peyote ceremony was that I had this simultaneous increase in religious spiritual commitment and religious spiritual tolerance. And that's something that people who are more religiously committed tend to have a reputation for being less tolerant. And people who are the most tolerant tend to have a reputation of being the least committed. But I think that what we see from people who have, whether it's psychedelic experiences or naturally occurring mystical experiences, there's a level of religious spiritual commitment and tolerance at the same time that increases. So that was one thing that kind of I wanted to explore. And I'd be very interested in maybe doing a quantitative study on something like that at some point. And that kind of led me into some of the things that I was, but because it was a qualitative study, I wasn't, supposed to measure those things or come up with ways of doing that. It was more like exploring your experience of how psychedelics impacted your commitment and your tolerance and your competence as a counselor. And so those are kind of things that, and even I was told the word impact is a quantitative word. It's more about your experience is more a qualitative term. So, anyways,
Uh,
but yeah, it was
yeah, thanks for clarifying all that.
right.
What's one thing that you really kind of like learned from this, from interviewing all these folks?
Yeah. So, well, the there were kind of 8 major themes that were described in the study, and the first. So there was preparation, integration. A lot of people emphasized the need for that. There were 3 kind of content ones that were environmental content and inner content and outer content. And I defined those as the environmental content is how you perceive um, the normal waking world during a psychedelic experience. So, how you encounter nature, how you interact with other people. Um, and the inner content was more your emotional experience, how what's going on inside at during the experience. And then the what I called outer content was more like visions and kind of what you're encountering. There were a lot of people who had spiritual visions of different entities or even deceased relatives, or very powerful meaningful experiences. And so then there was a religious spiritual changes section. There was a healing section, which was very profound too. And then there was kind of a cautions, concerns, miscellaneous section. Um, and so incorporate, and there was obvious overlap between a variety of them, but part of the process was putting them into categories and then explaining that there is overlap, but they fit in these kind of boxes, and having it be that way. And so, but yeah, I mean, there were a lot of amazing stories that people shared, and I, uh, there I can talk a little about some of those if that could be helpful too.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So um, I can I can think of, so there's one relating to inner experience where there was a gentleman who described a very profound sense of peace and wholeness, and it didn't have any of the, and I think this is a prime example of the inner experience one, because it didn't have all the outer content, but it just was an experience of all is well. And he said he had a mushroom experience. He was sitting on a rock in nature and just out there and the beautiful skies, and just had this sense of all is well, and this wonderful peace of the harmony and balance of the universe. And so that was an experience. Just the emotional experience of that is something he's drawn on for the rest of his life. And this happened, decades ago. And it was, something that simple. Just this profound experience of peace and all is well had stuck with him for so long. And then there were many great examples of the outer experiences too. And these are the visions people would have. And especially with ayahuasca experiences, people would encounter beings or have profound visions. And I remember there was one woman who had uh, insomnia and panic attacks her whole life, and had built up a relationship with ayahuasca where she really trusted it to guide her through experiences and whatever was needed. And she shared that she it was inviting her to relive this trauma that she had. And she said, no, 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 I know that that's where the panic attacks and insomnia come from. I know that's where it comes from. I don't need to go there. And then had this sense of the ayahuasca telling her, this is the way. This isn't easy, but this is the way. And she went back into it and had this and like relived the experience. And um, she was, you know, choked up when she was even sharing this with me. But she said, and after that, after that experience, I haven't had a panic attack or
Wow.
insomnia since. And it's not like I have to do ayahuasca regularly to keep them away. They're gone. And
Right.
and this is someone who is a clinical mental health professional who is you know just sees so much value in this. And there was another experience of a man um, who was divorced, whose wife had cheated on him, and he had this experience of it was on ayahuasca of a vision of all these faces of people in his life just coming before him. And he saw his mom, his dad, his friends who he just sort of maybe a little more minor forgiveness that he needed. And then it got deeper and deeper with people who had harmed him. And then he kept saying, I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you. And he felt this weight coming off his shoulders. And then he says, and then next, my ex-wife's face. And that's where the real healing started.
Mm,
And he described being aware that he was in this where he physically was, holding the hand of his guide and just crying and breathing, but then also in this other state where he was doing all this work. And it was just such a great description of that. And he said that after, really crying and purging that, he was able to say, I forgive you, and felt this tremendous peace. And so it was, and then he said, and honestly, I have, that's, I have moved on. And that experience really helped him to have that forgiveness and healing. And there were other profound experiences too, where people encountered uh, the one woman described this was a psilocybin experience, encountering the divine feminine in a way that was she was in this beautiful valley and saw this pink mist, and it was just such a lovely experience, and how this communicated to her these spiritual truths. And uh, so she shared some of those, and I quote them in my dissertation. I don't want to butcher them now as I'm uh, sharing this, but that was another really profound one. People who experienced different, like maybe spirit guides or however, experiences of the divine, encounters with um, whether it was deceased relatives was another one. There was someone who was not a Christian who had an experience with Jesus. And so there's a lot of these profound encounters that people encounter, and it's really an amazing thing, and they're so healing that it's obvious that there's something good going on here. It's not just your imagination running wild. There's a real connection to the spirit realm, or to our whatever other dimensions of reality. And it's such a mystery, but it's clear that there's something real going on.
Yeah. And did any of these folks like talk about how maybe it's impacted their clinical practice at all? And curious, like, do they show up differently? Do they view kind of mental health differently from these experiences? I don't know if they've shared any of that or if you chatted with anybody about that.
Yeah, that was one of the things that one of the questions I asked in my interviews too. And I think there was one in particular I'm thinking of who said that it helped him recognize that in a session, there's so much more underlying stuff going on with the therapist and the client than you really recognize that there's so much more than meets the eye going on there, and being much more in tune with all of the, whether it's something as subtle body language or sensing kind of people's, sounds unscientific, but sensing people's vibes and, kind of really just, which counseling is a science and an art, and
Yep.
so it's very helpful to be. I mean, I think an interesting study might be on emotional intelligence in psychedelics. That maybe for this particular participant, it really heightened that in him, and that's what he was getting at. He didn't use that term, but emotional intelligence. But I think in what he was describing, as I'm sort of sharing this now, maybe that's something that could be potentially explored as a way that it helps clinicians. But I think the majority of them did say that their psychedelic experiences helped make them better therapists.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I remember when I was in undergrad, I think I wrote a paper about why mental health clinicians should be either doing some of this kind of inner work, because it does help us to, I guess, perceive things a little bit differently at times, and I think can be really impactful. So yeah, it's super interesting that you did this. And when I was just trying to do a little bit of a Google search to try to learn a little bit more about you, I came across this really interesting blog on Dr. Rick Strassman's site, and it sounded like you interviewed him, and he had. I think it was like the first time I really read more about his personal experiences, which was really cool to hear. And there was one thing that stood out and kind of wanted to ask you about this, just not from his experience, but just from a general perspective. He talked about having like some really profound experiences, psychedelic experiences, but he wouldn't always classify them as spiritual. And I wonder how you define that. And I'm thinking about some of my own experiences where during my early 20s I did have some really profound experiences, and maybe that I think some of them did have some entity encounters. And do I classify that as spiritual all the time? And so I think that's just like a really interesting question, like what is spiritual and how people define that. And even if you're saying I had a very, very profound psychedelic experience, is it always spiritual?
Hmm, it's a good question. Yeah, and yeah, and Rick, I'll talk about him a little. He was one of the participants in my study, and I've known him for probably a little over 10 years now. He was one of my mentors who helped. One of the first people I reached out to about doing a dissertation in psychedelic spirituality and figuring out what subject to go into. Helped connect me with people at Hopkins, like Roland Griffiths and Bill Richards, and Bill became another good mentor of mine, and then became one of the people on my dissertation committee. And then also that sort of helped, with me getting into, with me becoming aware of the CIIS program and going through their program too. And so yeah, Rick is great guy and agreed to waive his confidentiality because all of the participants have confidentiality of whether they're about their stories. They're all anonymous and all the names have been changed. But then in his, he wanted to post his transcript of his interview on his website, and I said, absolutely, that'd be great. So, yeah, and he shared some phenomenal stories, and it was really great to have a conversation with him about all that. And yeah, I think that to answer your question about spiritual experiences, I think that for me, I have a very wide range of what I think of as spiritual. And I think for some people who aren't religious or spiritual, or maybe they're spiritual but not religious, but they still, I don't know. I think that for me, the meaning of the word spiritual is very broad. I think probably the word religion is very broad for me too. And I think some people may not be as comfortable with how broad that definition is, so they may think that if I see something as profoundly healing, I understand that as a spiritual change or spiritual encounter. Like the story of forgiveness that I shared with the gentleman who's was overcoming, his wife cheating on him in the divorce. That was a very spiritual experience for him. And I think that, so whether it's um, a spiritual encounter with some kind of spiritual entity, or just but whether it's that or something like a very profound inner experience, is just as spiritual. Encounters with nature, that was the environmental content section, was very, a lot of those can be deeply spiritual in a lot of ways. So I think that my definition is anything that is deeper than just this secular materialism, anything that's deeper than what we, you know, see and encounter on a daily basis. Anything that's more deep and meaningful is something that I consider spiritual, whether it may be called sacred or divine or holy or yeah, it's something that is, and really anything is spiritual in a way. Like I think of Thich Nhat Hanh saying doing the dishes is a spiritual
Yeah.
experience. If you're mindfully doing it, it's a spiritual experience. And so I think that my definition of that may be more broad than other people, but when I ask them what is a spiritual experience that you had on psychedelics, they might think, well, I had this encounter with what I felt like were beings from another dimension. And to me, that sounds very spiritual, but to other people, it may not, because they have a definition of spiritual that is, you know, a little more, a little narrower, not in a bad way, but just a little
Right. And I guess it
different.
really depends on the individual and like kind of
Right.
their beliefs and cosmology, right? Of like how they perceive. Because I could think about those early experiences I had with like, say, an entity, and it was a spiritual experience, but then, I remember thinking back, I don't know if I really thought it as spiritual at first. I thought it was super weird, and it made me more, I guess, intellectually curious of like, what was that, right? But I think over time it deepened my spirituality, which is interesting to think about, like this weirdness turning into kind of more of this spiritual curiosity. So yeah, I guess it probably really depends on the individual and how you define that and how maybe you make sense of an experience.
Right, right. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So you mentioned something that I thought was interesting, and I'm coming back to something one of our teachers, Lenny, said. But he said, pastoral counseling felt like the best way to go. And hearing that, you have this theological background, you work in this field, and you're also trained as a mental health practitioner and in pastoral counseling. One of our teachers said, it feels like one of the best places where psychedelics can live is in pastoral counseling. And from a clinical perspective, like there might be, pretty like minimal use cases at times, right? When we think about traditional mental health. And then how does that then bleed on over into more spiritual care? And I think about my own experiences. It's like, okay, maybe it helped my depression, my anxiety, some of my PTSD. But then it started to get more into these spiritual and philosophical questions. And, is like, what is the role of, say, pastoral counseling or having psychedelics embedded into these other fields? Because we do get a lot of folks that are, people of clergy, and they're working in this field, and they go, "Where's my place here?" It feels like it's mainly just in the clinical right now, but it feels like they're a little excluded. But I think there's also huge potential, and just wondering some of your thoughts around this.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I think that when I was considering which PhD track to go down, I thought of a couple different options. Pastoral counseling was one. There was systematic theology, which is kind of the more uh, theological, intellectual, kind of reflecting, thinking about the mysteries of the divine. And then I also thought of perhaps church history and study the history of mysticism. And so all of those had, really important implications for psychedelics. But I think that pastoral counseling was what I chose because it was I remember I had a pastoral care class my senior year of seminary, and it really helped me feel led to that particular field. It was pastoral care for persons with mental illness and their families, and it was a great class. And I remember writing a paper on how different people who've experienced like psychosis or however and experiences that we would consider uh, experiences that we might consider to be a sign of being unhealthy would were actually very healing experiences for some people. Carl Jung in his Red Book, which uh, talks about his experiences and his mystical experiences, and seeing when I was kind of reflecting on that book, I didn't talk or on that paper, I didn't talk about psychedelics at all, but I saw so many connections to like a bad trip leading to being a healthy, leading to healing. And so I was very interested. I think in that class, it really helped guide me toward that particular field because I was thinking about what do I want to study for a PhD and move down that track. And I see it as because at the end of the day, it's cool and interesting to think about a lot of the deep theology and mysticism for me. I love that. But helping people is really where the pastoral counseling avenue is. And so I felt like it was more because as much as I love and appreciate theology, it can get very kind of ivory tower, and in pastoral counseling, it can be, that's kind of on the ground helping people who are struggling with depression, anxiety, other mental illnesses, and helping people feel more connected to God, to life. If you are, a pastoral counselor, or a spiritually integrated counselor, free to talk to people about that. And probably every counselor should, in a way, if someone wants to talk about their religion and spirituality. But so many therapists feel like they don't have adequate preparation to talk about religious spiritual issues in counseling. That was actually one of the interesting things I talked about in my dissertation that I found out doing the research for that there's studies that show Um, Very few therapists feel religious spiritual competence, uh, and they feel that that training programs lack um, the adequate amount to help address that
I
sort
don't
of
think
thing.
I may have had like one, like not even a class on it. Maybe it was like a topic within a class.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so, that's something that I think in pastoral counseling can really help because there is more of that background, and maybe with psychedelics and counseling training programs, if we come to see the day where you know clinicians in training are able to have psychedelic session themselves, that could really help, perhaps that could really help their own religious spiritual competence in counseling. uh, and so that's something that I think with pastoral counseling or spiritually integrated counseling can be really helpful for people because there's a real need for that in therapy, and especially all the content that comes up with psychedelics. It's really valuable to have somebody who you know understands the territory, and is open to understanding it as a real genuine spiritual experience, because so many people do. And if you have somebody that you know doesn't, you know that's not their worldview, then and they just think it's some kind of hallucination, that can probably seep into the type of therapy they're receiving.
Right. And I feel like this also kind of gets into a little bit of conversation of like, how does healing happen? Right. There's a conversation that took place at a conference I was at a few months ago, and it was about religious use contexts around psychedelics and talking about being able to do this within a church model, particularly like kind of the Native American church, and being able to kind of use that religious freedom as a way to use psychedelics. And one of I think it was a lawyer on that panel, was saying it gets really tricky because there's been some churches that provide, say, the ceremony of say psilocybin, for example. They're using psilocybin in that model, but then they might be advertising that like healing happens, and like their anxiety might get healed through these religious or spiritual experiences. And that's where that fine line is, for say like I think they said for like the DEA or somebody to come in and say, well, now you're not doing religion, you're doing mental health care. And it's a really interesting, I don't know, discussion to have. Like, where is that, right? Do people find healing through some of their mental health through feeling maybe more connected or having some sort of practice, and what is that balance there? And so I don't know, yeah, just curious to hear any of your perspectives around that.
Right, right. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it is, I think, important to, um, because of course, religion, spiritual uh, congregations can be a very healing place, and of course, you can talk about religion, spirituality in a therapy session, but they are different, distinct places. And I think that is, yeah, I think there's value in that, and I think there could be value in a combination. But yeah, that is an interesting thing to think about because yeah, if there were perhaps like a, let's envision psychedelics being legal for therapy, in this country or worldwide, and having a spiritual retreat center where you can use psychedelics, and there are trained pastoral counselors and people who are, equipped in both of those realms, and, to help facilitate. I think that could be extremely valuable. But you do need to have the credentials from both. You do need training in both, I would think. that you wouldn't just have. And there can certainly be clergy who are part of like the CIS training program, and learn to be a trained psychedelic assisted therapist. I'm not saying you have to go get your master's or PhD in counseling in order to help facilitate. A lot of it is, a lot of psychedelic therapy sessions require two, and one needs to be licensed, and one can be trained in a like the certificate model. But I do think that there's it's important for people in both counseling and congregational settings to know what their expertise is in, and not um, overstep that boundary, because it can be to the detriment. Even if it helps one person, it can be to the detriment to the field. In a way, it can make you, if you're advertising, will heal your depression at this, ceremony here, and maybe, in different cultures that is how they do it. So in a way, I'm sort of talking about the US model, right? But in, a Western kind of way of separating those two. But in other traditions and other cultures, they are very much enmeshed. And so, but I think that as far as we are in the immediate future, at least, we should kind of keep those in different contexts, unless you're in a way that combines the best of both of them, like at a spiritual retreat center with trained therapists and clergy who are working together. But it needs to kind of, jump through all the hoops that the DEA and FDA put out there, because it does that does help with not just legitimacy, but those hoops are there for a reason to help
Well,
you.
yeah, and I mean,
Yeah,
something that we've seen and heard throughout many of the years of doing this is also the harm that happens when people practice outside their scope. And, I
right.
raise that question not to say practice outside your scope or do it. It's more kind of like, just kind of thinking about more of these in a different way, right? Like when you just brought up that different kind of like people from different cultures may approach this differently. I remember I heard this story from a teacher of mine where this a bunch of social workers went to some country in Africa. I forget where it was, and they were providing care after, I think it was like a disaster that happened. And after a while, the people actually ended up kicking the social workers out and said,
Yeah.
like what's going on here? Like, well, you came in and you took us all individually and put us in a tent to constantly talk about all the bad things that have happened to us. And from their perspective, their way of healing was coming together in community, dancing and singing. And so, just thinking about like these different kind of cultural perspectives here. But yeah, here in the West, it's much different. But I always like to think about like, how do things evolve, and can we create new models? How do psychedelics play a role in that? And are psychedelics helping to create a new model around? I always like, I interviewed this guy, Dr. I forget his first name, but it's Dr. Teta, and he wrote a book called "The Art of Human Care," and I like that. Instead of talking about healthcare, how do we bring the human element back into it? And so I'm always kind of thinking about that. How are things evolving? How can we evolve these different fields? But yes, also very important to practice within your scope, because harm does happen when people do kind of practice outside, and they may be offering services to heal your depression or PTSD, and we'll use PTSD for example, and they have no trauma background, they have no trauma training, and sometimes that's a very delicate balance, and we need to be very careful with that. So also, yeah, so thank you for raising that, and also
Right,
playing
right.
around with this thought experiment too.
Yeah, yeah. It is a very important thing to think about, because it is, they mental health healing and spiritual healing are so much more enmeshed than our society seems to make them. I mean, I think that in mental health, we are realizing that they are very, very connected. But at the same time, it is important to, yeah, not practice beyond your scope is certainly a important thing because it's so there can be potential for so much damage if you do it.
Yeah, right. And also thinking about like maybe some of those group contexts where somebody does need really deep healing. That healing does happen in that group container, say maybe from more of a spiritual perspective. But, what type of care can they actually deliver if somebody is, say, reliving a very significant trauma, and nobody is really trained to kind of help that person through it, right? Because they're just not staffed, or that container just isn't the place for that healing to happen, right? So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
yeah. Awesome. Well, we are over an hour, so we're getting at time. Anything that you want to close with today? Any sort of final thoughts that maybe we haven't touched on? Anything that you're still thinking about?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that I think is most exciting for me with psychedelic spirituality is to envision what the future holds for humanity. That are the spiritual evolution of the human species is such a fascinating topic to me. And it's something that we all participate in. And I really see our the development of human spirituality, the evolution of human consciousness can be assisted by psychedelics. And I really believe that. And in chapter 2 of my dissertation, I talk about my um, what was it called? The conceptual framework of my dissertation. And so in there, I talk about Ken Wilber's integral theory. I talk about Christian mysticism as two of the foundations of my theoretical framework that the dissertation was written with, kind of my worldview. And at the end of the dissertation, a lot of the people I interviewed had similar themes of the transformation of society and this really optimistic view that psychedelics, they may not do it all by themselves, but they can help facilitate this growth into a better human civilization. And something that is really exciting to me is to be a part of this and to help people grow spiritually, to help people get more in touch with the divine, to help people understand the meaning and purpose of life in deeper ways. And I think that psychedelic spirituality can really help with our growth as individual human beings and collectively as a human species.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree, and it's a fascinating time in human history. There's so much stuff happening, and a lot of exciting developments like this whole psychedelic field. Do you have an online presence if people want to learn more about you? Are you anywhere online or?
Yeah, I really think I need to be. I'd like to, maybe we do have a church website that is stmatthewavon.org. I do have a Instagram that I think I'll maybe try to turn that into more like, I don't know, psychedelic pastor or something like that. But right now it's Brian underscore Rajcok on Instagram. So feel free to follow me there. I do. I'll make it public and put my dissertation up there, and probably share the recording of this on there and that kind of thing. I've thought, people have said to me like, you should get a website and put your sermons up there and put your because I'm working on publishing a shorter article about my dissertation, so sort of a summary of it, because the dissertation is 360 pages, but then maybe try to condense it to like 20 pages so people can
It's for
read.
the devoted.
Right, right. So, but yeah, so actually, I'm thinking about that. I should probably work on that and maybe try to have a little more of an online presence, because I, you know, think that could be fun to share some things that way.
Yeah, definitely. It feels helpful in today's world, but also can get a little overwhelming. Sometimes I'm a little overwhelmed with social media and
Right,
all that
right.
stuff.
Absolutely, right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
try to, you know, take it easy with too much social media and all that, but I do see the value in it. So absolutely, and yeah, and so Brian Brian underscore Rajcok Rajcok on Instagram, um, and that's probably where I'll share any psychedelic related stuff.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Reverend Dr. Brian Rayshok, thank you so much for being here for this great conversation. I hope everybody enjoyed this. And yeah, thanks. Thank you again. And we'll catch everybody on the
Yeah,
next
thank you
episode.
so much, Kyle. It was my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me on.